Great. Great. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very, very much for joining us. And again, a huge thank you to Caressa Govender from RHAP, who's just helping with the co-hosting this evening and with some of the practicalities and the tech in the background. I'm Dr. Madeleine Muller, and I'm doing a session tonight for us as part of the Rural Health Onboarding Program. For those of you not aware of it yet, we've created a 6 weeks program to help orientate new clinicians to rural healthcare in the Eastern Cape. But this is not just, this topic tonight, it's not just for people new in rural healthcare. As a matter of fact, it's quite relevant for those that's been around for quite a while as well. And starting to really look at how do we manage to thrive and not just survive in rural healthcare. So being a clinician in a rural health setting is probably one of the most stressful jobs on the planet. And I think already just being in that job already shows that you have extraordinary skills already in terms of how you manage your stress and how you manage your job satisfaction or your thriving within your work setting. But it's not just good enough to be sort of good at stress management. To be able to manage in rural health, you almost have to have a super skill. It's a bit like having those special ESMO-E drills or those special neonatal resus skills. We need sort of super skills in terms of really managing within a rural health setting and not finding ourselves burnt out within our first year of starting. So just as there's lots of wonderful medical advances and technology, isn't it amazing what we did with the COVID vaccine this year? Similarly, there's quite a lot of advancing and us understanding actually how stress affects us and how we can work with that. And we can actually learn and gain a better understanding of how to work with our stress by understanding the physiology of how stress works. So in tonight's session, it's impossible to cover the whole broad spectrum of everything there is in the world of stress management, thriving, job satisfaction, preventing burnout, etc. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to focus on trying to lay a really good foundation of understanding exactly how we get affected by stress. And I'm going to have 3 parts that I'm going to focus on. And when I looked at I've been creating this particular theme for over a year or 2 now. And when I had to look at what is it that I'm going to bring, because just as you choose what you're going to bring, there's quite a lot of stuff you leave out. I'm going to bring tools and skills that I have found particularly useful in my life when a few years ago I had to weather some heavy stuff. We all have those times in our lives when things get a bit more stormy than we were prepared for. And then it really starts looking, well, what can I actually use? What's actually helpful at this period of time? And the things I'm bringing is things that I personally also found very useful and that I've also found really useful in mentoring and supporting doctors in rural health. So we're going to have 3 parts in this presentation. It's a full 90 minutes because I thought let's do it properly and not just skim the surface. But it will be recorded and it will become 3 little recordings. So if you find by 7 o'clock the kids are screaming in the background, feel free to leave and we will have available the different presentations. So part 1, I'm going to focus on neurophysiology, how stress affects the brain. That's the boring bit. Part 2 is the exciting bit because we're going to look what happens to you when you get stressed. And part 3, I'm going to look at one of the key components of what makes the difference between doctors that are thriving and doctors that are merely surviving in a rural healthcare setting, or for that matter, in any healthcare setting. There we go. So the first part we're going to look at tonight is the neurophysiology of stress. And when we go to medical school, we get taught a lot of stuff about stress. We understand how stress changes the body. We understand about the different systems in the body. But interestingly enough, there's not always enough focus on exactly what happens within the brain when we are stressed. So this is just a little bit of revision for those of you who's been out of medical school for a few years. Remember, we have 2 major systems. We are always in 2 major modes when we go through our daily life. We're either in survival mode, when the sympathetic system is predominantly in control, or we are in what I'm going to call creative mode. Sounds better than parasympathetic system. And that's when we are relaxed, we're not stressed, we don't have any adrenaline in our system. And we're always in either one of these 2 systems. So it's like a a seesaw. The more the one is, the less you have of the other. And just to remind you, in your body, these two systems actually changes your physiology dramatically. So if you're in survival mode, you'll have an increased heart rate, you'll be breathing faster, you'll have a sweaty periphery, you'll have a slowed metabolism, you don't digest your food properly. Where if you're in the creative parasympathetic side, you have the exact opposite. So you will have a resting blood pressure and pulse, you'll have a relaxed muscular system, and you'll have full metabolic function. So this is just what's already happening within your body. And it's almost like it's two different bodies that we live in, depending on what's happening in our lives. The photo on the left there is out of Grey's Anatomy. That's not out of one of our rural hospitals, in case any of you were wondering. But in neurophysiology, at exactly the same time when we're having this sympathetic parasympathetic thing happening, our brain also changes. And it changes the way the brain focuses its vascular blood supply. So when we're in survival mode, so that's when the sympathetic system is overdrive, the primitive brain, your limbic brain, is going to be in charge, and you're now going to think differently than when you're in creative mode and your prefrontal brain is in charge. And we're going to be looking a lot at the difference between those two brains and how they function. So just briefly, if we're in survival mode and we've got that primitive brain in charge, we're thinking very much cause and effect. We are trying to face off a threat of some kind, and we therefore try as quickly as possible to figure out what's causing the threat and how do I get out of this situation. Interestingly enough, you have no imagination when you're in a stress mode because you're just trying to actually get away from that lion or out of that car accident or whatever is threatening your life at that moment. And it helps you to take extremely quick decisions to be able to increase your chances of survival. And what's very important is you don't actually have much access to your higher brain functions. You sort of have your basic cerebral cortex, some of your reflexes, some of your habits, some of your basic thinking mechanisms, but the limbic brain cuts off all of the blood supply to that part of the brain. Now, the opposite is when you're not in survival mode. So now you're nice and relaxed, you're not stressed at all, there's no adrenaline in the system. And now suddenly we're able to have access to our frontal lobes, to our prefrontal brain. We can start thinking laterally. We can start being empathic. This is a much slower decision-making process. We can think something through, look at the pros and cons. And this is where we can be creative, innovative, and this is where our intelligence lies. We're going to look at this in more detail. But that just shows you these two modes that they're in. And what we must remember is there's a switch that switches you between one mode and the other mode. So although there's always a little bit more sympathetic or a little bit more parasympathetic, you can't have both at the same time. It's like an on-off switch between the two. And of course, the thing that switches it on from creative mode to stress mode is adrenaline. So it's triggered by any kind of fear or any level on which we feel threatened. Now, as you will well remember, and as you've always explained to your patients who might have anxiety, fear does not always mean walking down the street and running into a lion. There's also other things that might trigger this fear response. And I'm going to quickly take us back a little bit of old-fashioned psychology. You'll remember that triangle of Maslow, where you have those different levels of needs that need to be actualized. And if you look at your different levels of needs there, I'm going to divide them into three major groups. And this is the three major levels on which we feel threatened. So we can either feel bodily threatened. So if you're almost in a car accident, if you get attacked by a wild animal, or even more horribly, if you're in a domestic situation, we are threatened by somebody in your house, maybe getting attacked, or if you're in a scenario where your car is getting heisted, that is obviously your most basic form of feeling safe. But your next level is that as human beings, we also need to feel safe emotionally. We need to feel that we belong to a family or a community where we are loved and accepted exactly as we are. And you can already see when we think in terms of looking after children and raising children and good parenting, a good parent is to do about making children feel safe. They need to feel safe bodily, and they need to feel safe emotionally. But on a third level, we also have a need to feel independent. We need to be able to speak our mind. We need to be able to live our life choices. We need to be able to feel we can work independently and that we are respected and appreciated for what we offer in terms of our professions or us as a person. And sometimes our need for emotional safety and being one of the crowd might be a little bit different than our need for being independent and having our own thoughts. But of course, human beings are wonderfully complex. But this gives us different scenarios in your work life where things might happen where you might not feel safe. And whenever you don't feel safe, even in the slightest bit, your body makes a little bit of adrenaline. You've got that little bit of a feeling, oh, I don't like this, not happy. That adrenaline switches you between those two modes that we were looking at. So I'm going to speak specifically, I'm going to spend some time on the survival mode, because the problem with survival mode is we have a bias towards survival mode. The body thinks that it should always be aware of needing to survive. And therefore, it puts us in survival mode very easily. And one of the problems with survival mode is that with survival mode comes lack of insight. So the part of your brain that's supposed to have a little bit of perspective about the fact that you're in survival mode actually gets cut off at that very moment. And therefore, survival mode can sometimes rule our lives without us always even being fully aware of it in the moment when it's happening. Now, I'm going to introduce here one of the books. I will have the reference at the end of this presentation in terms of some of the people that I am sort of building these ideas on. And Prof. Steve Schwartz has written this amazing book called The Chimp Paradox. He's a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book about neurophysiology and created some very lovely metaphors to help us understand how our neurophysiology functions when we are feeling stressed. And he describes our limbic brain, or that survival part of ourselves, as a chimp. And you can see it can be very lovable. We're not going to make it an evil thing, but it can also be a little bit of a pain when it is off leash. So if we look at the survival brain, just to remind us, you have that limbic brain that sits there right above the brain stem. Some people clump together the limbic brain as well as the reptilian complex into what we call the survival brain. And that survival brain has very specific purpose of what it does and how it does things. So remember, we get a little bit stressed, we go into survival brain mode, the limbic brain is running the show. And the mode of operating, you can think about it now, you're in the jungle, right? The whole purpose of the limbic brain is survival, perpetuation of the species, keeping everybody safe. So it has very specific instincts that it works with, and these instincts work specifically through adrenaline. So when you have adrenaline kicking in, your limbic brain takes charge, and you have three modes that you can go into to try and battle this particular challenge that you're having. So you can either fight it, you can flee, go away from it, or you can freeze in the spot. And we're still inheriting that from our old animal days. So those things will kick in regardless of what we think we should do. As soon as you get fearful, they will kick in before you stop giving it a second thought. But also part of this chimp part of ourselves, this part of ourselves that belongs to the limbic brain, is what we call our drives. So these are the things that makes us human. We cannot distance ourselves from our chimp or our limbic brain. It's an essential part of who we are. So everything to do with sex, the guy you're eyeing across the other side of the the mesh, what do you guys even have in rural hospitals? There is no other people there, are there? The whole issue of dominance, the whole power plays that we have within organizations, everything to do with feeling hungry, needing to get food, everything to do with security and feeling safe, everything to do with territory at the moment, the expropriation of land, long history of all the pain caused by not being able to have your own territory, your own place, and everything to do with troop, family, community. These are all very basic drives that all belong to our limbic system, and they are important in their own right. Now, when the limbic brain is in charge, so the adrenaline is flipped, we're thinking in limbic brain thinking, that thinking is super fast and super strong. It's much quicker and faster than our thinking in our cerebral cortex or our prefrontal brain, because it is designed to keep us safe. So it's the one that kicks in first, and it's the one that tends to overwhelm everything else that's happening. And we're going to look at the qualities of what that kind of a thinking is, because I want you to be able to start in your own life recognizing, when is it my chimp chattering away, or when am I actually using my higher functions to think? So chimp thinking is very emotional. It's all about feelings. I feel this, I don't feel that. You all know, those of you that's managed to get through, you all managed to get through medical school or getting through your particular training, whether it's nurse training or rehab training. You've managed to get as far as you can because you're managing your chimp, because we don't always feel like studying. We don't always feel like going on those lectures. We don't feel like being on call. We don't feel like getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning for that cesarean section. And yet that not feeling part has to become secondary to what needs to be done. The other thing that the chimp does is because it has to think quickly, it likes to make guesses. So it fills in detail by assumptions. If there's not enough information, it will make stuff up. And this is a narrative function that the chimp has, which is quite useful when you're, for example, walking through the field and there's a rustle in the grass and you think, oh, that could be a snake, and you jump to the other side, even though you didn't even see the snake. But that keeps you safe by making assumptions of what you think is going on. And of course, this narrative bias is one of the big issues why we run randomized, double-blind, controlled studies, is because bias starts filtering in everywhere when we look at information. A lovely example has been the extraordinary narratives around ivermectin. Now, I'm not going to open up the ivermectin debate because it's interesting what an emotional debate it is, isn't it? I mean, in the end, it's just information. There's a drug that's come out. It might help. It might not help. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. But the conversations around ivermectin has been extraordinarily emotional. And so what you see happens is you get stories that gets built up around both for and against. There's certainly no one side that's got all the answers on this one. And that is that anxiety. One's feeling slightly anxious, we're terrified, wanting to help our patients, and we can either jump for a drug that might not work or jump for a drug that is working and we don't have enough evidence. Both of those are valid things to do, but we find that we are making up stories to try and enforce whether we are pro or against ivermectin. Chimp thinking is also unstable, it's inconsistent, it's irrational, it's unreasonable. Those are the conversations where you realize you're not getting anywhere, you're not getting through to somebody, they don't seem to be making any sense, you're probably talking to their limbic brain. The other favorite thing, or the favorite sport of the chimp, is jumping to conclusions. So you all would have heard of confirmation bias, the other reason why we ring trials. This happens, for example, when you see a patient, you already think you know what's going on, and as you examine the patient, you will find things that will confirm what you think is already happening. That's a chimp function. It likes to find shortcuts to answers, but it doesn't think things through. It thinks in black and white, so the ivermectin is a good example. For me, there's lots of different ways of thinking about ivermectin. It's not a black and white issue, but you find both sides has turned it into a black and white issue because we're having a limbic conversation around it. And also very important, the chimp has got very much a negative bias. It's always going to look for the worst case scenario. It's supposed to find, look as safe. So if you hear a rustle on the grass, you don't assume it's a bunny, you assume it's a snake. And similarly, when you are in scenarios at work with relationships, what you are hearing tends to have a negative bias in those scenarios. And probably the most important thing to remember about the chimp is that it has emotive judgment as its primary way of looking at the world. It judges quickly and it judges without mercy. And we have all been on the receiving end of that, being judged horribly by somebody else. And we have all given out our fair share of judging others unfairly when we find ourselves in this mode. So this is just an example of what happens when that chimp is completely off leash. So most of our life, we sort of have the chimp on the lead. I'll show you in a minute on how the two parts of the brain work together. And we sort of trying to keep that chimp to basically keep it under some control. But every now and then you'll have a scenario where that chimp just gets off leash and it makes havoc. And what's happening in this scenario is you have a complete overflush of adrenaline. And if you have a high amount of adrenaline in the system, your limbic system is completely in charge and your whole higher function will get cut off. So you become basically slightly mad. So this is the scenario where you have somebody who's shouting, confrontational, when you're trying to explain something, keeps on interrupting you. They use emotive words, they use hints, they use sarcasm. They might actually try and dominate what they're saying through speed and volume and with body language. And when they talking about, they're only focusing on the problems. They're only focusing on what is wrong, and they're only focusing on what they're feeling. And they can even be quite devious. A good example of this kind of conversation, and we'll talk about the adolescents later, is having conversations with your adolescents about things like what time they're supposed to come back in. And when you're on a scenario like this, it's helpful to realize, hold on, we are no longer in a rational space, and we can't easily get back to that rational space. And we'll look at that a little bit later. So that's giving us a bit of a feeling for that chimp mode, that and how that chimp mode behaves. So let's just look at the opposite of that for a moment. So when are we not in adrenaline, and when that switch is switched off, and hopefully quite large parts of our day, we should be spending in creative mode. So I'm going to call, like we have the chimp that's in survival mode, I'm going to call this the observer. Shajar Chamin, which I will speak about later, he calls it the sage. Prof. Swartz likes to call it the human. You can find different ways on how you identify with that figure for yourself. And the creative mode, this part of ourselves lies within the whole frontal lobe area, but specifically on the prefrontal cortex. So again, it's not that that's where all our thinking and decision making is happening, but that is what leads when we are in creative mode. So when we are not in limbic system, the limbic system is now quiet, it's happy that everything is nice and safe. This is our prefrontal brain, is the one that then decides how we make decisions. And just like we talked about the chimp in the jungle, when we're going to think about our creative mode, I'm going to call this the humanity center. That's from Prof. Swartz as well. And this part has got very different, it's like a completely different personality in your own being, because the purposes are very different. Your chimp wanted everything to do with survival, where your humanity center, it's all about self-fulfillment, having a purpose. What is the meaning of my life? Why am I sitting in a rural hospital in the middle of nowhere? What is it that I have to offer? What is it that this is offering me as a person? So those big questions lie within that side of ourselves. And just like the chimp was operating by the laws of the jungle, it all had to do with fight, freeze, flight, and having to react and respond to what happens to the world. Here we start seeing ourselves within a larger community. We start looking at the laws of society. This is where all our ethics and our moral drives are lying. And these are the qualities that we associate with that area. So our qualities of honesty, our ability to be compassionate, our ability to have a conscience and think about the higher meanings of things, our ability to be law-abiding, our ability to be able to control our impulses and control that limbic brain. We don't immediately have the cookie, can wait a little bit. And this is also where we're able to be tolerant and flexible and understanding of others. This is the part of your brain that's able to step into somebody else's shoes. If you're in chimp mode, and say, for example, you are running away from a lion, I like bringing up the lion analogy, you can't at that stage philosophize about the poor lion is probably hungry and, maybe he's going to starve and it's not good for the environment to not also feed the lions. You cannot think about anybody else when you're in survival mode. And so the chimp is always inherently extraordinarily selfish. Our ability to be altruistic, unselfish, and compassionate lies very much within our prefrontal brain. So this way of thinking, which comes from the prefrontal brain and the frontal brain, is much slower, as I've mentioned, to the chimp, and it requires more energy. It's much easier to jump to a conclusion than to think something through properly. And there's another lovely book, which I've got in the reference section as well, called Slow Thinking, Fast Thinking, that is written by a behavioral scientist who's won a Nobel Prize for his work in looking at how these different parts of the brain, and it's a thick book. It's got lots of sections specifically on bias. So all our biases are when we too quickly can tend to come to an understanding of something, which is what the chimp brain does. To be able to get past bias, we need to use time to really think things through, crunching that data. So when we're in that mode, we interpret information by searching for the logic and truth of something, and our thinking is logical, and it's a logical base for what we decide to do. This is evidence-based, the way we think. It's rational, as I've mentioned, and always in the context and within a wider perspective. So it doesn't only focus on the problems, it also focuses on what has been leading to it, what is happening around this particular thing that I'm trying to figure out. It understands that the world is not black and white, and able to understand all of those shades of gray, and therefore come to a balanced judgment. So instead of just having one side of the pole, you start seeing both sides of the story. It's empathic. and it's creative and innovative. So these are the sort of qualities that helps us to really figure out that clever way of managing a patient, come up with the best way of dealing with a situation at work, coming up with new innovations to manage new diseases like we've had with COVID. We have to use the slow thinking part of our brain. And then this term I've stolen from Brene Brown, also an amazing writer about vulnerability and very useful to read for somebody who's gone through really difficult times in their life. And she's got this lovely term, which she calls being generous in our assumptions. And it has to do with how we view the world. So remember the chimp, when they look at the world, they judge without mercy. If you're having a bad day and behaving badly, you will get judged for what you do and what you say. But if we're thinking from our frontal brain, we become generous and going, hold on, maybe they're not meaning what they're saying. Maybe they're just having a bad day. I've got a memory when I was a teenager. So teenagers, very much chimp brain in full fling. And one day my mother was obviously exhausted and we were having, I don't know, I think we were too loud as kids, and she stormed into the room and she shouted to us, "I wish I never had children," stormed out again. And for many years, until I, of course, myself had children, I believed that that was what she really thought. For some reason, we will judge people by the things they say when they're in chimp mode. Once I had my own children, I fully realized my mother has never even for 1 second in her life doubted the fact that she wanted to have children. She loved her kids. It's one of the most important and best things in her life. And that day she was having a chimp moment. And I, as a teenager, was not very generous in my assumption of that. And we often do that. We will hold people to that thing they've said in anger as if that is the thing they really mean, where actually that is usually the very thing that they don't mean. So now let's start looking at how this worked together. And I'm going to use this is my own particular metaphor. For those of you that don't know, that is the part of the ship, you call the bridge of the ship of Star Trek. And it just shows how these different parts work together. So you'll see in the front here is the survival brain. And what's very important to understand is that the survival brain is always driving. So if you think of this as your ship, your consciousness ship, we're traveling through space through our biography. Here in the front, they're now looking through the big screen out at all the lovely stars. And these guys drive the ship. They actually do the work. So the chimp is the one that when you're driving to work, when you're communicating with people, when you get into all those little things that you're doing habitually every day, that's the chimp getting work done, right? Because it's quick and it's efficient and it doesn't use too much energy. In the back here, we have our prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the captain of our ship. So in Star Trek, he's the guy who has to decide where we're going to go. How do we want to, where do I want this biography to go? How do I want things to play out? And hopefully that's where the decision making should happen, is from the prefrontal cortex, even though the chimps are doing the driving. And then in between, you have your big cerebral spheres where all your computers are. You've got your left brain and your right brain. And within that is all your different strengths, functions, neurological functions that you use to help you make sense of the world. So if we just flip that a little bit into metaphor side, so here in the front is your chimps. They're looking out through the screen and they're driving the ship. Behind them, I've called him the sage here, as the captain of your ship. Hopefully he's giving instructions to the chimp in terms of what we want to see happening. And then some of you might know the HBDI model in terms of looking at your different strengths. In terms of left brain, right brain, we all have different ways that we, where we go when we solve problems, for example. And I've just put the 4 in there. So you've got these different parts of our brain, and we all use all 4 parts of our brain, but we have places we like more than others. This computer that we have in our brain is available for both the use by the sage or the use by the chimp. So either of them, the chimp can actually hijack the ship and drive the ship, and he will use some of our higher functions to justify some of the stuff that he's doing. And similarly, our prefrontal brain will use those to actually navigate the world that we live in. So what that chimp does when it's sitting in that driver's seat, it's supposed to screen the environment. It's supposed to look out for any funny blips on the radar screen. It's supposed to figure out what's good, what's not good. And if everything seems safe, then it relaxes, and then we use all our ability. It's like that thing when you drive all the way to work and you can't even remember if there was traffic lights, or you've sat and you can do a stitch a guy up, and at the end you can hardly even remember all the different things that you were doing. You go into an automatic mode because your chimp has recognized that everything is safe. But if the chimp feels unsafe, remember those 3 different levels, it's going to trigger that fight, flight, freeze response, and it's going to come up with suggestions to the captain of the ship. This is hopefully how it should work. And hopefully the captain of the ship then has to look at those suggestions. Okay, my chimp's unhappy, it's feeling a bit freaked out, and make a decision on what are we going to do about what is needing to happen. So in the ideal world, and this is where we all want to head to eventually, I think this is what growing up means, unfortunately, is as we grow up, we want to get in a scenario where most of our day, our sage, our captain, is making the decisions about what needs to happen. Our chimp just gives information to the sage. And out of that, we will have these extraordinary strengths that come to the fore because we are using this extraordinary frontal lobe brain of us. Everybody has this. Every single person, doesn't matter how educated your patient is, it doesn't matter if they're literate or not, it doesn't matter where they come from, they all have this extraordinary ability of these higher human functions. Compassion, of being able to look at the bigger picture, of being able to make good decisions about their lives. But of course, the challenge is what happens, I'll show you the picture in a minute, when the chimp comes in charge. So I just wanted to have one slide on the development of this chimp prefrontal balance. And the challenge is that the primitive brain myelinizes first, it matures first. So by the time the child is about 13, 14 years old, that limbic brain is completely myelinized and that chimp is fully grown. So the child's chimp is already in action trying to deal with survival because that's the priority for a small child. The frontal brain is already there and is being developed, but the final maturation of that prefrontal cortex is only going to happen by about 21, maybe even a little bit later. And so that sage is not yet mature in the teenage brain. It's one of my favorite pictures. So if you can imagine this lovely dog here, dog, chimp. There's also a lovely metaphor for adolescence that I was told about the other day from a lovely OT about how to train your dragon. So, and you can see in this scenario, there's a very large chimp on a lead, and there's the little sage. As long as the chimp doesn't run away, we might be okay. And that's one of the reasons why we so struggle with teenagers with risk taking. The chimp is the one that takes all the risk. The chimp is the one that thinks itself to be immortal. And unfortunately, when the chimp goes on a runaway, there's not much control. And we as adults and as parents still need to create the safety for our young people when they're going through that phase of their lives. But it's not that at 21, you suddenly now have a fully grown sage and everything is fine. At 21, when your sage is finally mature, when you finally have a prefrontal brain, now the training of the chimp starts to happen. And that's going to happen for the rest of your life. So that is a process as we grow up, as we grow older, we're constantly having to find this way of how do we make sure that we're not being dragged after the chimp and the chimp calling the shots, but that we're actually deciding on how we want things to happen in our lives. So the trick, the first metaphor, we're going to have a few that we're going to work with in part 2 as well. But the one metaphor I want to bring here that I want you to start thinking about as a tool you can start using in your daily life is to become aware that you have always 2 points of view when you're looking at the world. And it's an extraordinary capability that we as human beings have something called dual awareness. We assume that animals do not have dual awareness, mainly because of the way that they behave. Dual awareness means that you can be aware on your prefrontal brain of what the limbic brain is doing. So those of you who have ever tried to meditate, for example, or maybe even in prayer, when you're in a scenario and you've decided you're now going to not think about anything like they do in some meditations, or in mindfulness, you're only going to focus on something else, you will notice that your brain starts to chatter. You get all kinds of odd thoughts, and then you think to yourself, no, I shouldn't be thinking about that. I should be meditating. In that moment, when you're able with one part of yourself to notice that another part of yourself is thinking, you are in a state of dual awareness. And that's an extraordinary skill, being able to be aware of our thinking. And that's because we have these two focuses of consciousness within our neurological system. So when we're in limbic view, when we're in the limbic brain and we're in chimp mode, so there's adrenaline on, we're actually on what I'm going to call the street view. So you're in the streets, there's lots of people on the streets, it's busy, and you're just trying to figure out, what do I have to do in the moment to survive this particular scenario? So that person is either shouting at me, or I'm busy doing cesarean section and everything's going wrong, and all you can see at that moment is out of that limbic brain perspective, which I remember I told you is not very innovative, not very creative, doesn't think very far, not very intelligent. And the trick is being able to step out of that into what we call balcony view. So that is the possibility of being able to notice, oh, that's my chimp kicking in, and being able to step back out of it and being able to notice how we are thinking and notice what is going on in our limbic brain. Can't even always control it if you're in a full flush of adrenaline, but just being able to make that distance already makes a massive difference. It also makes a difference when you're in the world and you're in a scenario where a lot of people are very stressed and very upset, and you're finding yourself getting upset, and then you're getting dragged into street view. If you're in that scenario and you're able to step into balcony view, you're able to look at what's actually going on and really understand what's going on for this other person, and maybe be able to manage that situation much more appropriately. So this brings us towards the end of my part 1 presentation. And this is Prof. Steve Peters. Oh, I got his surname wrong. Terrible. Prof. Steve Peters, who wrote this book, The Chimp Paradox. It's actually quite old already. And it's much more, he gets much more complex than my description here. But it's a really good book in terms of neurophysiology. And what I find useful about this is these are very useful images to also use when you're describing and talking to patients, especially patients who are struggling with anxiety, or are struggling with temper outbursts, or are struggling to manage their lives. So very, very useful. I'm going to ask you to be patient with me while we go on to the second part in terms of questions. So what we're going to do is at the end of part 2, we're going to open the chat for questions and discussion.